I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Russia, from oil curse to sanctions, how Moscow has steered its economy from the brink of collapse. Also this week, South Africa, a member of the BRICS Club, but lagging in economic growth and jobs. Why does the economy continue to disappoint, and what's needed to turn things around? Plus, while the world takes aim at Qatar's labor laws before the 2022 World Cup, countries are still lining up to send workers there. We talked to Pakistan's labor minister to find out why. Well, oil is often seen as a curse for energy producers, and it's certainly been the case for Russia. 70% of its exports are oil and gas. But things could be changing as Western sanctions designed to punish Moscow over the conflict in Ukraine backfire. It appears Russia's economy could recover from hitting rock bottom. Many local industries are picking up the slack from international companies. Now, you may remember the bleak picture from December last year when the currency was tanking. In an attempt to stop money flooding out of the country, interest rates rose to 16%, and more than $100 billion was spent propping up the ruble. With reserves plunging from $510 billion in 2014 to $385 billion early this year, the currency has risen almost 25%. Such is the concern that an economic recovery could be undermined by a strengthening ruble. The central bank has spent almost $1 billion to keep it down. Inflation, currently at about 16%, is likely to fall to 12% this year. That's according to the International Monetary Fund. And while the economy is going to contract 3.4% this year, 2016 should see a small upturn with 0.2% growth. Well, in Russia, the money in people's pockets nowadays is going a lot less far than it used to. The reason? Mainly the European sanctions imposed on the country due to the Ukraine crisis. Charles Stratford from Moscow tells us the full story.
Maxim Gradniev went into business with a friend 3 years ago. He runs a successful farm around 200 kilometers outside Moscow. He grows vegetables, breeds chickens and geese. He's keen on getting into milk production. His beekeeping project is overseen by his grandfather. The honey is popular with locals. The government banned food imports from the EU and US in August in retaliation for Western sanctions slapped on Russia following its annexation of Crimea. The country's agricultural sector has suffered years of underinvestment. President Putin says the food embargo is Russia's chance to become more self-sufficient, and Maxim agrees.
The embargo means less imported goods, so we are able to be more competitive. We have a problem with some seeds supplies, but there are more positive points for us than negative ones because of the sanctions imposed. I completely support President Putin's policy. Why should we buy from someone else when we can do it ourselves?
Russia was importing around $9 billion worth of food from approximately 6,000 European companies before the government announced the embargo last August. Now, President Putin says it offers local farms like this the opportunity to boost production. And it's a plan both he and the farmers say is working.
But it's not quite as simple as that. This is Danilovsky Market in central Moscow. Most of the food on sale here is locally produced. Prices rose when the value of the dollar fell around 40% last year, following a steep fall in the price of oil. The ruble is showing signs of recovering as the oil price has risen slightly, but inflation is around 16%. Retail sales were down 9.8% year on year in April. The money in people's pockets goes a lot less far than it used to.
Our life has definitely changed because the products that we used to use are no longer available, so we have to find alternatives. Of course it's bad because even the locally produced products were not so expensive before, but now it's happening and we have to look for new ways to save money.
The West's sanctions against Russia for backing separatists in eastern Ukraine began in March 2014. They target Russia's state finances, energy and arms sector. State banks are not allowed to raise long-term loans in the EU. Exports of arms are banned. 3 major oil firms are targeted, and dozens of senior Russian officials are now subject to Western asset freezes and travel bans. Everything may look normal on Moscow's streets, but look up and it's a different story. Much of the office space in these new towers remains empty, few can afford the rents, and many of the businesses that can are afraid to take the risk.
Last year, the developers built 1.4 million square meters of office space. This is Class A and Class B office space combined. It's pushed due to this limited take-up that we talked about. It pushed the vacancy rate up to 29.6% in Class A and 15.3% in Class B. This is very high. This is actually a new record in Moscow, because even 2008, the crisis at that time, it wasn't as bad as it is today. If you compare Moscow with other European cities in terms of vacancy rate, then everywhere in Europe, well, more or less, it is around 8, maybe 10%.
There are emerging signs that the worst may be over. Some analysts are even saying Russia has weathered the storm. The World Bank has raised the forecast for Russia in 2015. It sees GDP as falling by 2.7%, as opposed to its previous forecast of a drop of around 3.8%. But there are concerns about the long-term effects.
Interest rates in Russia are much higher than last year. We started 2014 with a level of interest rate 5.5%. If we're talking about the key policy rate, now key policy rate is 12.5%, so it's a material increase. So money definitely became more expensive in Russia and for Russians. Sanctions are also targeted to reduce Russia's ability to modernize its industry. So there is a number of restrictions for Russia to import new technologies. And this effect will come effective, I would say, with 3-5 years. Initially, we expected Russian companies and banks had to redeem around $100 billion a year to pay on the foreign debt. I would say we have enough money for the moment in terms of current account surplus to cover our foreign debt redemption. The key unknown for Russia and the key risk, this is the size of the net capital outflow, which is not related for debt payments, but is related to their preference for forex savings and preference of Russians to withdraw money abroad. This is a key and very unpredictable indicator, because last year the net capital outflow was around $150 billion for the full year, despite only $40 billion debt payment.
While questions remain about how Russia will deal with an expected extension of sanctions in July, and there are also growing fears of an escalation of fighting in eastern Ukraine, one thing is certain: the popularity of the country's leader continues to grow. The latest poll shows around 86% of Russians support President Putin in what they often say is his refusal to bow down to the West. Charles Stratford for Counting the Cost in Moscow.
Well, Oleg Kouzmin is an economist and vice president of Renaissance Capital. He joins me now from Moscow to talk more about this. So thank you for being with us. So first of all, have the sanctions actually focused policymakers on moving the economy away from an oil and gas-based one?
Russia is facing a challenging environment given a drop in oil prices and Western sanctions, but indeed, current challenging environment provides grounds for authorities to take some unpopular but very important decisions. This includes the increase in the retirement age of the population and the freeze of wages in the state sector. Both things could encourage import substitution in Russia. In addition, Russia also gets now fruits of much weaker exchange rate, which also encourages import substitution to some extent. Today we see that such industries as food or chemical industries are doing quite well despite unfavorable macro environment and falling domestic demand. So we think that indeed import substitution is going to some extent in Russia, and it could soften the recession this year, but obviously this is not enough to avoid Russian GDP growth falling slightly above 4% this year.
And which sections of the economy have actually benefited the most from sanctions?
Today we see that such sectors as food industry and chemical industry are doing quite well, and this is attributed both to a much weaker exchange rate and to sanctions that Russian authorities placed, limiting the imports of food from European Union countries.
Now, the ruble has strengthened in recent days, but still remains low compared to before the sanctions. How central is a weak ruble to this improvement, and how likely is it, do you think, that it will stay low?
Sanctions was one of the main factors that brought ruble to some new quality level. In the previous year, we saw ruble fluctuating around 30-35. This year, ruble is unlikely to appreciate more than above 50 rubles per dollar. Our forecast assumed that ruble could average at 55, 56 till the remainder of the year.
Now, the economy is still on course for a contraction this year, though, but the IMF believes it should improve slightly next year. But consumers are still the hardest hit, though, aren't they?
Yes, this year we see a big fall in consumer demand. We forecast that consumer demand could fall by more than by 5% this year, and this could be one of the main factors behind the fall in Russian GDP growth. We see Russian growth falling by roughly 4% this year.
Are we about to see a more protectionist Russia perhaps emerging as it tries to encourage more diversification?
Generally, we hope that we have seen the worst part of the sanction story, both from the Western side and from the Russian side. So we would not expect further measures, further protectionism introduced by Russian authorities. As all other things being equal, the main advantages that Russia could get from current environment, they result from much weaker exchange rate that improves national competitiveness. And this could be the main source of the ongoing import substitution story. So we would not expect further protectionist measures introduced by Russian authorities.
And what do you make of the chances that the sanctions on Russia might be lifted or at least relaxed at some point in the near future? U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry hinted that the sanctions could be lifted if Russia changed its policy towards the West and the Ukraine. How likely is that in your assessment?
We hope that both Russian sanctions and the Western sanctions would be removed in the middle term, because economic connections between Russia and European Union, they are quite high, and generally this situation doesn't provide a lot of good things, obviously for Russia, but also for European Union. We see quite limited chances that sanctions could be lifted this year, but we hope that the next year could bring us some positive surprises, especially from the European Union side.
Still ahead on Counting the Cost, these Venezuelans are not queuing up to get a ticket for a concert or a movie. In fact, they're lining up every day in the cash-strapped country just to get bread and milk. We'll tell you why. But first, the World Economic Forum, a meeting place for presidents, chief executives and NGOs, descended on Cape Town. And that got us thinking about South Africa's economy. The end of apartheid more than 20 years ago was a momentous achievement for South Africa, the establishment of democracy equally so. But economic gains have proved to be a tougher challenge. South Africa became the 5th member of the BRICS nations in 2010, joining Brazil, Russia, India and China. It is currently the 2nd biggest economy in Africa. But let's take a closer look at the numbers. These are the elected presidents in the post-apartheid era: Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki and incumbent Jacob Zuma. Now, this is the economic growth, and we're using numbers from the IMF. The picture doesn't look too bad, but growth averaged just 1.3% between 1995 and 2008, and that has pretty much lagged behind world growth over the last 20 years, as you can see there. But if you look at this, the jobless rate has actually risen and currently stands at 25%. So what's gone wrong? Why hasn't the country made progress on cutting jobs? Well, we're going to talk more about that with Henrique du Toit, Chief Executive of Investec Asset Management. He joins me now from the World Economic Forum in Cape Town. Thanks for being with us. Now, first of all, economic growth has been disappointing. But mining strikes are over, world oil prices have fallen, and yet the last set of economic numbers, 1.3% quarter-on-quarter growth, was disappointing. What do you put that down to?
I think the economic, the whole world is slowing down, not just South Africa. The whole emerging world is slowing down on the back of, at this stage, a lack of investment, but also there are some confidence issues. My sense is that the South African economy needs to take deal with some structural issues to get itself out of its current low growth path.
But if we look at the last 2 decades, not much has improved in GDP terms. The economy just appears to be kind of humming along. Why is that?
No, I think we had a very good decade or so. The first decade after the end of apartheid was a pretty good decade. The growth rate lifted, not as spectacularly as places like China or some of the other African economies, but lifted significantly. And it's only of late that we've seen these pressures, and not only driven by Eskom, but driven by confidence and driven by a lack of implementation of what is a very good long-term economic plan that exists for South Africa.
And if we look at unemployment, then that has to be a disappointment. It's steadily risen and is now around 25%. That looks like a lot of wasted talent.
Absolutely, and I think if you drill down and you look at youth unemployment, it is even significantly higher, as is the issue around the world, but just extreme in South Africa. And I think we're reaching a point, a time which requires extreme measures. And the key would start with an economic vision that is sold across the country to everyone, whether business, whether just ordinary people, so that we can get on track. I mean, if you look at Asia 20, 30 years ago, that's exactly what they did. And I think South Africa is reaching that point, and the sort of easy story of African growth that kept the momentum going is not there to drag it forward.
And what does the economy really need then to get going? Is there a need for more power plants? What other infrastructure is needed?
Ironically, compared to most developing countries, South Africa has an excellent infrastructure even today, physical as well as financial and legal. But what the power constraints are becoming very, very real, and then the willingness to think big. The implementation of program after program which has been announced, infrastructure, etc., which hasn't quite happened. And then, of course, ensuring that there's enough skilled labor available to drive growth and create employment for the less skilled. And that's really the big thing. Government has reached the limits in terms of what it can do, and government has done quite a bit over the last few years in terms of its own employment and social programs. But it now needs to be driven by a reinvigorated private sector, which ironically has the opportunity given the opening up of so many markets in Africa.
Hendrik Totoy in Cape Town, thanks for being with us. Well, Qatar's taken a lot of flack for its treatment of foreign workers, but that hasn't stopped them from coming. Overseas workers, mainly from Asia, send back billions in remittances to their families back home. Pakistan, for example, received $13.3 billion in the first 3 quarters of its 2014-2015 financial year. Raja Ashfaq Sarwar, Pakistan's Minister for Labour and Manpower, spoke to Osama bin Javid, and he explained why Pakistan wants to send 150,000 people to work in Qatar.
See, I would have raised this if I felt that the previous practices have not been improved, have not been catered to. But I feel it is being catered to, and it is their need over here right now, because of the FIFA World Cup and all that. They are very conscious of the fact that the laborers should be treated right and catered to.
Pakistan plans to send 150,000 people to Qatar in the next 3 years. What does that speak about Pakistan's ability to create jobs in the country?
Pakistan is a big country, and we have quite a few people, educated and skilled and semi-skilled labor who are available in the market. And for a better opportunity, for a better future, the government is coming with a new concept, with a new, traditionally they were not certified. They would come over here and what they are supposed to do, they were maybe lacking in that sense. So what we are doing, this is a beginning. Qatar is a beginning of the GCC countries. We're going to go to all the countries, GCC countries, and give them this guarantee of industrial safety. Then we have skilled, tested and certified labor coming from Pakistan. then vaccination, good health, police clearance. With our situation, I'm sure they're concerned about what kind of people are, so we'll have a police clearance for the papers properly scrutinized. Like sometimes they are misled, they don't know, they are not treated right, they are sent on wrong paper. But we're making a one window operation in which all their passports, their national identity cards, and all these things will be catered to.
Pakistanis contribute about $3 billion a year from the GCC. It's a very important part of Pakistan's international remittances. Why do you think GCC is important? And in the wake of recent events, such as what happened in Yemen, has that relationship been dented?
On the contrary, I have been received very well. And the kind of response I got, I did not, be honest with you, I expected less than that. I got a good response. They respect Pakistani labor. They respect Pakistanis. I guess the only thing they have been worried and they are concerned about is the process which they come through from Pakistan. Otherwise, I think the political happening, whatever happened lately, politically or otherwise, it does not make them any hesitant about getting labor from Pakistan.
Now, as an oil-based economy, Venezuela has long enjoyed the benefits of high prices for this essential global commodity. But oil prices have taken quite a tumble since last year. And now Venezuelans are looking at the prospect of things staying that way for the foreseeable future. Virginia Lopez asks just how low would be too low for Venezuela's oil-dependent economy.
Forced to stand in line for hours to find the most basic of food items, so much, if not all, of the oil-rich nation's future is hinged upon whether production cuts are agreed on this week's meeting.
If oil prices go up or down, I don't really know how that affects us. What affects me is the situation the country is in. A country so rich in resources, and we depend on oil for everything. I don't get it. You have to spend your life in a line to find meat, coffee, even toilet paper?
While other oil-producing countries have weathered the price drop from $100 to almost half, Venezuela has been among the hardest hit. But oil prices might not be solely to blame for Venezuela's faltering economy.
The financial crisis in Venezuela comes not only as a result of the drop in oil prices, but rather from failing to save during the times of bonanza. Other countries like Norway and Saudi Arabia invested, while Venezuela went on a never-ending feast.
In 1960, Venezuela helped fund OPEC to protect oil prices. It was a crucial player for years. Some even credit the late Hugo Chavez with being behind last decade's record high prices. But today, it seems to have lost almost all this leverage. Despite President Nicolás Maduro's intense efforts to recover oil prices earlier this year, Saudi Arabia and even Iran and Iraq are looking to boost production. Venezuela, on the other hand, has seen its production stagnate. Even after an unprecedented windfall from record high oil prices, Venezuela has been unable to tap into its oil reserves, the largest proven reserves in the world. And yet, President Nicolás Maduro remains confident that his oil-dependent country will withstand the current oil prices.
Even if the price drops to zero, no one will stop Venezuela. We've already recovered some of the price, little by little.
But with little chance of increasing production, and with experts predicting oil prices eventually settling at $60 a barrel, Venezuelans are nowhere close to ending their long waits in line and returning home empty-handed.
And that is our show for this week. But remember, there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.